Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
The glass didn't slip. It wasn't knocked over by accident, and it sure as hell wasn't clumsy hands or bad luck. I saw her wrist angle as she leaned forward, her fingers tightening just slightly before the base of the wine glass tipped. Rich, dark red Cabernet surged upward like a slow wave, sloshing straight across the front of my dress. Not just any dress, not something off the rack from the mall, but the dress I'd worked months to save for, the one I wore only twice before that moment, a limited edition emerald green satin piece from Malone Gray. The tag alone made me sweat the first time I touched it. For $1,000. Not even on sale. That dress wasn't just clothing, it was proof. Proof that I'd made it. That I wasn't who I used to be. That I'd finally pulled myself out of the mess I came from. And then, right there in the middle of my mom's living room, at my own damn birthday dinner, Jenna looked at the mess she made, at the ruined silk, the red stains spreading like a gunshot wound, and she laughed. Not even a guilty laugh, not a God, I messed up laugh, but a low, smug snort, followed by her voice, sticky with bitterness. It's not like you ever deserved it anyway. I didn't say a word. I didn't gasp, I didn't cry, I didn't even touch the dress. I just stood there, wine dripping slowly from the hem onto my shoes, heart pounding so hard I could hear it behind my teeth. I felt it, the familiar rush of heat that used to crawl up my neck every time Jenna cut me down in front of our friends, or made a joke at my expense that was just teasing, or got that look in her eye when something good happened to me. That look that said, "Why you and not me?" The silence that followed her laugh was thick, uncomfortable, and no one at that table moved. Not Mom, not our cousin Rachel, not even Jenna's on-again off-again boyfriend Todd, who had been nursing a beer and avoiding eye contact since we sat down. It wasn't just the spill. It was everything behind it. Years of small stabs, quiet digs, and side comments finally bleeding into the open. I think what got to me the most wasn't the ruined dress, or even the way she tried to brush it off like I was being dramatic. It was that underneath her laughter was something darker. Satisfaction. As if destroying something beautiful was her way of making sure I didn't forget where I came from. As if she believed she had the right to humble me, just because life had humbled her. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't scream, and I sure as hell didn't give her the satisfaction of watching me cry. I simply excused myself, walked upstairs to the guest bathroom, peeled the wet fabric off my skin, and stared at myself in the mirror. Hair done, makeup perfect, body still humming with adrenaline. And I thought, no, this doesn't end here. Because what Jenna didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 hours earlier, while I was picking up the dress from the boutique's tailor for a final fitting, the manager had offered me a cup of coffee and asked me how the dress worked out. I'd laughed and told her it was for a family thing, and she rolled her eyes and said, "Girl, we get drama in here all the time. Just last month, someone tried to return a cocktail dress that came back with foundation, glitter, and a full glass of red wine down the front. She said it happened at the store." Then she motioned to the tiny dome camera above the register and said with a grin, "Thank God for footage, right?" I don't know why I did it. Maybe I had a gut feeling. Maybe years of Jenna's little betrayals had finally taught me to expect the worst. But I asked the manager, offhand, if the cameras caught the front of the boutique. She said yeah, most of it, especially the register and the alteration area. I left it at that. But when I got home and opened the boutique's thank you email, I saw the line that made my stomach flip. "Let us know if you need any support. We keep 2 weeks of footage on file." At that moment, I didn't know I'd need it. But I knew enough not to delete that email. Now, standing in my mom's bathroom, watching the ruined fabric sag off my shoulders, I made one quiet decision. I wasn't going to let this one go. Not this time. Jenna had spent most of my life throwing stones and hiding her hand, grinning while I took the blame, while I brushed it off, while I played the good daughter card to keep the peace. But what happens when the one person who never fights back finally does? I put on a clean shirt, tossed the ruined dress into a dry cleaning bag, and walked downstairs. Jenna looked up from her phone, and for the first time that night, her smirk faltered. Maybe it was the look in my eyes, maybe it was the calm, Or maybe some tiny instinct in her, some leftover sibling connection, knew I was no longer playing by the old rules. She didn't speak. Neither did I. We sat, we ate, we toasted half-heartedly, and when dinner was over, I hugged my mother goodbye and whispered, "Check your email in the morning." She gave me that tired smile she always did when she didn't quite understand what was going on, the smile she used when we were kids and Jenna blamed me for something and I just swallowed it. But this time, I didn't swallow anything. I walked to my car with my chin high, my keys steady in my hand, and a strange calm spreading through me like a secret. The footage was real. The file was clear. Jenna's hand, the deliberate angle of the glass, the flash of that smug little smirk. It was all right there. And what she didn't know, what made her laugh so gut-wrenchingly pathetic in hindsight, was that I'd already sent it. Not to the police, not to the boutique, not to some lawyer. To Mom. Just hours before the dinner, with no explanation, no warning, no revenge plan, just one simple subject line, "Thought you should see this." Let her open it. Let her see. Let her decide who's been telling the truth all along. Because sometimes, silence isn't weakness. Sometimes, silence is the last breath before the storm. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was angry, though I had every right to be, and not even because I felt humiliated or violated, though the sticky memory of wine soaking into that silk kept replaying in my head like a scene I couldn't escape. It was something else entirely. Something colder, more focused. A sense of absolute clarity that had been building quietly for years, like a pot just below boiling, finally beginning to tremble at the edges. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, not thinking about the dress itself or even the cost, but about the look on her face after she did it. The glint in her eye that didn't just say oops, but screamed, "You don't get to have nice things." Jenna had always had a talent for positioning herself just close enough to be excused. She never screamed or threw tantrums or made obvious scenes. No, she worked with subtlety, a cold kind of cruelty dressed up in sarcasm, and just kidding remarks, always pulling back just in time to avoid full accountability. And somehow, she'd always managed to stay one step ahead of confrontation, knowing instinctively how to bend things until I looked like the one overreacting. But not this time. This time she'd slipped, just enough, and I wasn't about to let her get away with it. By morning, the coffee barely touched my nerves. I sat at my kitchen table, dress still bundled in its dry cleaning bag beside me, watching the sun creep across the floorboards and wondering just how far Jenna would go to keep playing the victim. She'd probably spent the night spinning a story in her head, something about being tipsy, or the glass being too full, or, "You know how clumsy I get, Mom," delivered with just enough fake guilt to slide out clean. And maybe, 10 years ago, that would have worked. But not anymore. After breakfast, I picked up the phone and called the boutique. Not angrily, not even emotionally, just matter of fact, like I was checking on a refund or confirming a delivery. The same manager who'd helped me before, her name was Claire, I remembered now, picked up, cheerful as ever. I thanked her for the fitting, mentioned how beautiful the dress looked that night, and then, very calmly, told her there had been an unfortunate incident at the dinner. She hesitated, her voice tightening just a little, probably unsure if I was about to blame them for something. But before she could speak, I clarified. I told her I wasn't looking for compensation, wasn't upset with their work, I just needed to know if I could access the security footage from the afternoon I picked it up. I told her it was a personal matter, nothing legal, just something I needed to clarify. She paused, then said she'd have to check with the owner, but didn't see why not, and that they typically kept around 14 days worth of footage. When I offered to come in person, she agreed and said she'd queue it up for me. No questions. No drama. Just the quiet efficiency of someone who, maybe, had seen enough of these situations before to know when not to dig deeper. An hour later, I stood behind the counter with Claire, watching the security monitor in the back room. The footage was grainy but clear enough. There I was, stepping into frame, the hem of the dress lifted slightly as I turned to admire the tailoring in the full-length mirror. Claire fast-forwarded to the point where Jenna had walked in unexpectedly, claiming she just happened to be nearby and thought she'd see the dress before dinner. That alone had felt off at the time. Jenna never just happened anywhere, especially not in my part of town, especially not on a weekday when she was supposed to be watching someone's kids. The moment that stopped us cold was short, maybe 4 seconds total, but there was no mistaking it. The camera caught the angle perfectly, Jenna standing near the counter, picking up my dress from the back of the chair, examining the label while pretending to admire it. Then, as Claire walked into the fitting room to grab a different belt I'd asked to try, Jenna reached forward with the edge of her water bottle, not even hers, it turned out, but one she grabbed from a sample tray by the door, and pressed the base of it gently against the lower hem. Just enough to dampen the fabric, not enough to leave a stain. Testing maybe. Measuring how it would react. It didn't end there. Claire fast-forwarded again to the footage from the next day, the day of the dinner, when I came back to pick up the final adjustment. I looked peaceful, excited even, chatting casually while Jenna lingered near the entrance. The footage from then showed her watching me pay, following me to the door, and then, unmistakably, stealing a glance at the bottle of red Claire had gifted me for my birthday. Jenna held it, studied it, then smiled. I watched her mouth move in silence. She's going to love this. Nothing about that moment screamed malice, not to anyone else, anyway. But I saw it now. That small smile. That flicker of something dark in her face. She'd planned it. Maybe not every step, maybe not down to the second, but enough to know that she didn't knock that glass over by accident. Claire glanced at me as I stood there, mouth dry, skin prickling. She didn't say anything, but I think she saw it too. She offered to send me a copy of the footage, just in case. I gave her my email and, after a beat of hesitation, asked if she could also send it to another address, my mother's. She didn't ask why. Just nodded and typed it in. The drive home felt longer than usual, the kind of quiet where your brain won't stop running scenarios. I kept thinking about what would happen when Mom opened the email. I hadn't added a message or explanation, no context at all, just the video and the timestamp. I knew her well enough to guess what she'd think. At first, she'd feel confused, maybe even a little defensive on Jenna's behalf, because that's what moms do. But then she'd hit play. And once she saw it, really saw it, she wouldn't be able to unsee it. Because that's the thing about evidence. It doesn't yell or accuse or beg to be believed. It just sits there, unblinking, undeniable. And when the truth comes from a lens instead of a mouth, there's no spin that can save you. What would you do if someone you loved or really loved destroyed something precious to you and then laughed in your face like you were the fool for caring? Would you rise above it? Would you confront them? Or would you, like I did, bide your time, collect your proof, and wait for the exact moment when the truth could no longer be denied? By the time I got home, my phone had 3 missed calls from Jenna. No voicemails. No texts. Just her name, 3 times in a row. Whatever story she'd tried to spin after dinner, whatever false apologies or performative guilt she'd rehearsed for our mother, it had all started to unravel. And she knew, somehow, that I'd pulled the thread. She just didn't know how much had already been stitched into place. When I got the text from Mom that said, "We need to talk, both of you," I already knew the conversation wasn't going to be a calm one, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be short. There was a tone in her writing, even without punctuation or emojis or extra words, that told me she'd seen the footage, probably twice, maybe more, because Mom was the type to watch something once and then again with the volume down. As if that would change the truth sitting right in front of her eyes. She didn't say what it was about, she didn't have to, and I didn't respond immediately, not because I didn't want to, but because I wanted to walk into that house fully composed, with every breath measured and every nerve steady. There was no sense in letting emotion trip me up now, not after I'd waited years for someone else, anyone else, to finally see who Jenna really was behind all that polished bitterness and practiced charm. It was early evening when I pulled into Mom's driveway, the late sun throwing long shadows across the porch like quiet warnings, and I could already see Jenna's car parked slightly crooked, like she always left it, as though even her parking habits refused to follow rules. I walked up the steps, heard voices inside, low, sharp, urgent, and took one last breath before turning the knob and stepping in. The room fell quiet the second I crossed the threshold, not dramatically, not with gasps or stares, but with a heavy, expectant silence that felt like the moment before a storm breaks. Jenna was already seated on the couch, legs crossed, one hand resting casually on her thigh like she was trying hard not to show just how cornered she felt, and Mom stood by the fireplace, arms folded. Face unreadable in that way she always used when she didn't want either of us to know whose side she was really on. I didn't say a word. I didn't look at Jenna. I simply nodded toward Mom, walked to the armchair across the room, and sat down, mirroring Jenna's posture just enough to remind her that this wasn't her stage anymore. The tension in the room was dense, the kind of tension you don't even need to speak into, because everyone already knows why they're there, and no one wants to be the first to say it. But eventually, Mom broke the silence. "I watched the video," she said, her voice calm but clipped, the kind of tone she used when she was trying very hard not to lose control of the situation. "Twice. And then again this morning." I didn't want to believe it. But I saw what I saw. At that, Jenna shifted in her seat, her mouth twisting slightly into something between a grimace and a smirk, as though she was weighing whether to deny it outright or play the misunderstood card. I knew that face well. I'd seen it after she accidentally told our neighbor that I'd been caught cheating on a high school math test I never even took, or when she forgot to pass along a scholarship form that had arrived in the mail while I was away at camp. This was the face she made when her hands were still technically clean, but her fingerprints were all over the mess. "I didn't pour the damn wine on purpose," she said finally, her voice rising just enough to sound defensive without appearing hysterical. "It was an accident, and now you've both turned it into some conspiracy like I'm out to destroy her life or something." And, just like that, I felt the old rage rise, not the explosive kind that yells and curses and throws plates, but the colder, heavier kind that fills your lungs and tightens behind your eyes. The kind that doesn't come from one moment, but from years of biting your tongue while someone chipped away at your peace, one sarcastic joke at a time. "No," I said, my voice lower than hers, but sharper. "You didn't destroy my life, Jenna. You just tried to ruin something you knew I loved. And you got caught." She scoffed, rolled her eyes, and turned to Mom with a pleading look that reeked of desperation. "She's always been like this," she said, waving a hand in my direction like I was a performance she didn't care to watch. "Ever since we were kids. Everything had to be perfect. Her grades, her room, her stupid little vision boards. And every time something didn't go her way, she found a reason to blame me." I should have stayed silent. I should have let the footage speak for itself. But something in me snapped. Maybe it was the phrase, "stupid little vision boards," or maybe it was the memory of prom night when Jenna told my date, a boy I genuinely liked, that I was planning to dump him right after the dance just to see if he'd still show up. He didn't, by the way. She claimed she was protecting me from heartbreak. That was always her angle. Undermining dressed up as concern. Sabotage masked as sisterly love. "You want to talk about childhood?" I said, my voice finally rising to meet hers. "Let's talk about the time you stole the heels I bought for my internship interview and told Mom you thought they were yours. Or how you told my college roommate that I'd been seeing her boyfriend behind her back just so I'd get kicked out of that apartment and come crawling home." "That was a misunderstanding," she snapped, but her eyes were shifting now, looking not at me, not at Mom, but somewhere else, inward, probably, where the walls were closing in. "You've spent your whole life pushing me down just enough so I'd never get too far ahead of you," I continued, barely pausing, because once the words started coming, I couldn't hold them back. "You didn't want me to fail. You just didn't want me to succeed more than you. And now that I have, you can't stand it." Mom didn't interrupt. For once, she let it play out. Maybe because, deep down, she knew I wasn't just unloading years of resentment. I was pulling back the curtain on a dynamic that had been festering in our family for decades, one we all tiptoed around to keep the illusion of harmony intact. Jenna stood then, pacing toward the window, rubbing her hands like she needed something to do. "You think Mom always sided with me," she said, spinning around suddenly. "You think being the older one meant I got some kind of special treatment? No, Alyssa, I just didn't quit when things didn't go my way. I didn't run off to the city and bury myself in a fancy job and a fancy life and a $4,000 dress like that was going to erase the fact that you were never really one of us. That one hit. Not because it was true, but because it was the closest she'd ever come to saying what she really felt, that she believed I didn't belong, not to the family, not to the town, not to the history we shared. That somehow my success made me disloyal, made me arrogant, made me forget where I came from. I didn't run, I said quietly. I climbed. And you've hated every rung I touched. The room went still. Even Jenna, for all her flailing, didn't have a comeback. She just stared, jaw clenched, chest rising and falling like she was trying to find air in a room that suddenly had none. And then, after what felt like hours, Mom stepped forward. Not toward me. Toward her. You need to leave, she said softly, but with a weight I hadn't heard in her voice in years. Tonight. Pack your things. We'll talk again when things settle down, but right now I can't have this in my house. Jenna didn't speak. She didn't scream or throw a fit. She just nodded once, stiffly, like she was accepting a sentence she didn't agree with but couldn't argue. She walked past me without making eye contact, out the front door, into her car and drove off. For the first time in decades, there was silence in that house. Not the uneasy kind, not the explosive kind, but a silence that felt like breathing after holding your breath too long. And yet, beneath that stillness, something else stirred, because deep down I knew this wasn't over. People like Jenna don't disappear quietly. They just retreat until they find another opening. The silence that settled over my mother's house after Jenna left was the kind that doesn't immediately bring comfort or clarity, but rather casts a long shadow through every hallway, lingering in the corners like the remnants of a storm that hadn't fully passed, just drifted far enough away to make you think the worst of it might be over. It wasn't the peaceful silence of resolution or the satisfying hush that comes after a long-awaited confrontation, no, this silence had teeth. It scratched at the edges of my chest, hollow and sharp, because even though the truth had finally come out and even though Jenna had been told, in no uncertain terms, to leave, there was no celebration in that moment, no victorious exhale. Only the haunting weight of everything that had been said, and, more painfully, everything that still hadn't. Mom stood near the kitchen now, her back to me, her hands braced against the counter as if she needed the granite beneath her fingers to anchor her to the present moment. Her posture said everything her mouth didn't, tension in the shoulders, weight shifted slightly off balance, like she'd just been hit with a truth she'd spent too many years trying not to see. I stayed seated in the living room, the same place I'd sat through holidays and birthdays, graduations and groundings, and yet the room felt unfamiliar, like someone had rearranged the air itself. And maybe, in a way, they had. Because when the truth finally slips through the cracks, when the lies and justifications and selective blindness can no longer hold up the walls, something shifts forever. After a long pause, Mom finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady, and she didn't turn around when she said it. I knew, deep down, she whispered, I knew there was more going on between you two than you ever said. But I thought if I didn't choose sides, if I just kept things calm, it would somehow fix itself. I didn't respond right away. I wanted to be angry at her for saying that, wanted to shout about how silence isn't neutrality and how peace bought through denial is just another form of complicity. But I didn't. Because the truth was, she looked tired, not the kind of tired that sleep could fix, but the kind of tired that came from carrying guilt for too long, from trying to love two daughters who had grown up at war with each other while pretending that nothing was broken. I didn't want to force you to choose, I finally said, my voice lower than before, not out of fear or weakness, but because there wasn't much left to shout about. I just wanted someone, anyone, to see what she was doing and say it out loud. Mom turned to face me then, her eyes red but dry, her expression unreadable except for the thin line of her mouth that used to smile so easily and now looked carved in stone. I saw it, she said. Not all of it, but pieces. Moments I didn't want to believe meant anything. Times when she'd say something and you'd go quiet, and I told myself you were just being sensitive. Or that she didn't mean it that way. I nodded slowly, not because I forgave her yet, but because I understood. People like Jenna are masters of manipulation not just because they lie well, but because they make their cruelty small, digestible, even plausible. They inject their venom one drop at a time, never enough for a full reaction, just enough to make you question your own perception. And the people watching from the outside, the ones who love both sides, they want so badly to believe it's nothing that they start convincing themselves that maybe the victim just has thin skin, or a chip on their shoulder, or a need for attention. She's angry at everything, Mom continued, walking slowly to the table and sitting down across from me, her voice heavier now. Her divorce, her job, her life not turning out the way she wanted. And she looked at you and saw every success she thinks she deserved. I should have stopped it sooner. I should have said something when she made that joke about your promotion last year, or when she accidentally sent those photos of your high school ex getting married. God, Alyssa, I'm sorry. There it was, the apology I'd never expected, the one I'd secretly craved, but had given up hope of ever receiving. And it landed not like a weapon, not like a wound, but like a breath. It didn't undo the past, didn't rewrite the years, but it cracked something open between us, something that had long been sealed shut by our mutual need to keep things pleasant. I leaned back in my chair and looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel like I was sitting across from a referee or a gatekeeper or a woman caught between two loyalties. I saw her as someone who had made mistakes. Yes, but who had also finally chosen to stop pretending. I don't want her here, I said, and it didn't come out cruel or spiteful, just honest. Not until she owns it. All of it. Not just the dress. The years. The lies. The way she weaponized closeness, and then acted like I was the one tearing the family apart when I pulled away. Mom nodded slowly, her fingers twisting around the napkin she hadn't touched since dinner. She's not coming back, she said. Not until I believe she's ready to be someone different. It wasn't a promise. Not really. But it was enough. We spent the rest of the evening in a kind of quiet that was new for us, not forced, not heavy, but reflective, like the house itself was trying to understand what had just shifted in its bones. I left before dark, kissed Mom on the cheek, and told her to get some rest, and for once, she didn't try to stop me with awkward jokes or questions about when I'd be back. She just nodded and watched me go. But later that night, as I curled up on the couch with a book I couldn't focus on and a half glass of wine I didn't really want, my phone lit up. Jenna. No words, just a screenshot of an old message thread, one I hadn't seen in years, between me and a former coworker I'd briefly hooked up with during a particularly messy breakup. It wasn't scandalous, not really, but it was personal and taken out of context, it could look messy. Attached was one line of text. You think this is over? I know your secrets too. The tightness returned to my chest, not out of fear but out of disbelief. Because even now, even after everything, she still thought she could win this with threats. She still believed, somehow, that dragging me down would save her from sinking. But what she didn't know, what she never seemed to understand, was that I wasn't the same girl she'd tormented all those years, the one who bent and never broke, the one who kept family peace above self-respect. That girl might have panicked. This one hit send. Because while Jenna was digging through the past looking for leverage, I had already spoken to the person that message involved, explained the situation, clarified every detail, and more importantly, I'd gone to my boss 2 days earlier when I realized she might try something. I wasn't playing defense anymore. Let her try. The difference this time was simple. I had nothing to hide, and she had everything to lose. There's a strange kind of calm that settles in when you finally stop waiting for the other shoe to drop, not because you know it won't, but because you've already braced for the impact and found, to your own surprise, that you're still standing. That's how I felt the morning after Jenna's text arrived, after her not-so-veiled threat slithered its way across my screen and tried, one last time, to remind me of the version of myself she thought still existed, the version that could be intimidated, silenced, pushed back into the corner of a family narrative that had never truly made space for me unless I kept my head down and my expectations even lower. But I wasn't that girl anymore, and the moment I read her words, "You think this is over? I know your secrets too," I didn't flinch. I didn't even feel anger. What I felt was something closer to exhaustion, like watching someone claw at the sides of a hole they dug themselves into, still convinced they could crawl their way back out by dragging someone else down with them. I didn't respond to the message, not immediately and not with words. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table, stared at the empty cup of coffee in front of me, and thought about how much time I had wasted over the years trying to be the bigger person, trying to preserve relationships that were never built on respect to begin with. Relationships where love came with asterisks, conditions, and caveats. I thought about the thousands of tiny moments I'd swallowed, the snide comments brushed off as teasing, the humiliations dressed up as concern, the jealousy wrapped in paper-thin smiles. And then I thought about what it had cost me, not in money or missed opportunities, but in dignity, in self-worth, in the peace of mind that comes only when you finally stop giving people the benefit of the doubt after they've used that benefit like a weapon. The old message thread Jenna had screenshotted, the one she apparently thought she could use to shame or control me, wasn't even scandalous. It was a series of flirtatious, vaguely inappropriate texts between me and a former coworker that took place years ago, long before either of us had any meaningful commitments, during a time when I was making bad decisions in the wake of a bad breakup, trying to feel something other than lonely. It wasn't my proudest moment, but it wasn't a secret either, not really, and certainly not something I hadn't already acknowledged, especially not after that same coworker had transferred departments and, later, ended up married to a woman who'd become one of my closest friends. What Jenna didn't know, and what I wasn't about to explain, was that I had already gotten ahead of her. The second I'd recognized that look in her eyes during dinner, that predatory glint that told me she was calculating the next move even as she spilled wine on my dress, I started preparing for the possibility that she'd come at me sideways. So I'd reached out to that coworker, Josh, and told him the truth, that my sister might try to use something from the past to hurt me, and that if anything ever came up, I wanted him to hear it from me first. He laughed when I told him. Not out of cruelty, but because he knew exactly the kind of manipulative family dynamic I was describing. He'd lived through something similar with a cousin who tried to blackmail him once over some ancient online posts from college. Tell her to get in line, he'd said. And maybe update her blackmail tactics. It's 2025. We're all overexposed. Still, I didn't stop there. I drafted an email to my manager, not dramatic, not emotional, just clear and preemptive, explaining that someone in my personal life might try to make noise by sharing out-of-context messages. I attached the full conversation chain, highlighted the dates, and clarified that it had no bearing on my current role or performance. My manager responded within the hour, thanked me for the transparency, and added, frankly, if that's the worst skeleton in your closet, you're doing just fine. So when Jenna's message came through, all smoke and bravado and petty revenge disguised as moral superiority, all I did was take a screenshot of my own, one showing my email to HR, the thread with Josh, the polite and professional acknowledgement from my boss, and I hit send. I didn't say anything. I didn't threaten or gloat or explain. I just sent it, silently, like dropping a stone into still water and watching the ripples spread, knowing the splash had already happened long before the surface broke. Hours passed with no response. Then a full day. Then 2. And finally, on the third morning, just as the sky was turning a soft gray and the city outside my window began to hum with the quiet bustle of people starting their lives for the day, my phone buzzed again. It wasn't from Jenna. It was from Mom. The message was short but heavy. She came by last night. She's unraveling. I don't know what to do anymore. I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether I was supposed to feel sympathy or vindication or something in between. Because as much as I wanted to believe that people like Jenna eventually reach a point where they see the damage they've done and make the choice to change, I also knew, deep down, that change only comes when a person is willing to lose the version of themselves that kept them comfortable. And Jenna, for all her posturing and bitterness, had never been willing to let go of the fantasy that she was the injured party, the overlooked sister, the one who deserved more and got less because the world had somehow betrayed her. I didn't reply to Mom right away. I took a walk first, down the same street I'd walked 1,000 times before, past the bakery that always smelled like cinnamon, past the bookstore that still carried a dog-eared copy of a novel I loved in college. And I thought about how far I'd come, not just in miles or job titles or dresses I could now afford, but in the quiet, almost imperceptible shifts in the way I held myself. The way I no longer waited for permission to speak the truth or looked for validation in people who were determined never to give it. When I got home, I finally responded. Let her unravel, I wrote. Maybe that's the only way she'll ever try to rebuild. I didn't know if it was the right answer. I didn't know if it made me cruel or honest or simply done. But what I did know, with a clarity that felt like standing in sunlight after years in the dark, was that this time I had nothing left to prove. I hadn't raised my voice, hadn't humiliated her, hadn't struck back with the same poison she'd used on me for years. I'd simply shown her the mirror and stepped out of the frame. And maybe, in the end, that was the real revenge. Not the footage, not the confrontation, not even the fallout, but the fact that I didn't need to win the fight. Because I'd already walked away from the war.